Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this great event. I hope to convey an idea of what are the challenges of the design after at the end, hopefully, of the era of the undesign of the world. I don't know if the word exists, but what we are seeing here, ta-da, is the release, the simplification, not to reach a minimal of complexity, but worse than that probably, of the complexity, of the ecological complexity and the social complexity of at least many of our countries in Latin America and in the tropics. The idea of development has brought us the complete destruction of the rainforest, by example, and this is where I would like to start. Here we are, at the beginning of the end. This is a picture taken of this year, the same year, and it reflects the destruction of many millions years of biological design. We are replacing one of the hotspots of biodiversity in the world, the Amazon rainforest, by a couple of species, pastures and cattle. Sometimes they have more coming, oil palm, some small trees, but usually what is left after the burning of this treasure is almost nothing. It's a shame, absolutely, as Greta Thunberg has reclaiming us in terms of climate change. And you see the smoke coming from the forest. This is also a sign that we are not really understanding how are we designing the future of the next generations. Fire is now, as the Maya tradition said, the way of destroying the world, and hopefully we'll need to find a solution to overcome the burning of the world. But still, you see the numbers, the astonishing numbers of fires around Colombian forests during this year. And the news that Bolivia lost 5 million hectares of rainforest in less than a month. That's the size of Costa Rica. Not to mention the northern part of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, the Mato Grosso, and Brazil. And Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela will start to burn our forests, our new season of destruction, in the next few weeks, because it's during the dry season when people has to burn to clean, quote unquote, the land. So we have a magnificent system of monitoring the destruction of the forest. As the president of the university has said, we publish at the same rate than the forest is burning, and we are not getting solutions. Hopefully, we can design again the way out. I think this is a very great message for this conference. And the way to go out is not just replacing and redesigning the world, but probably understanding better what are we doing now, how are we piecemealing this reality. Those are the numbers for Colombia for the last year. We are losing almost 200,000 hectares of forest every year, not just in the Amazon, but in many other regions. And let's see if our willingness to stop this works during the next months. You will see the news everywhere. But it's not just destruction for cattle and pastures. We also are undesigning the world by illegal mining, and we are destroying the rivers and creating a real hell for life by mercury poisoning of the waters of Colombia, Peru, as well as many other countries of the world. This is the resulting landscape, and is the outcome of many conflicting policies that allow illegal gold mining to be the preferred activity for society, for institutions, and probably the source of all corruption. I don't have pictures of illegal coca plantations, because that's another source of deforestation and destruction that we inherited from the last 20, 30 years, and it's still part of the destruction of the forest. So there's many, many ways by which we are really attempting to the future, and we are destroying, and I don't know the word, disassembling the world, and hopefully we still have some options to go, and I'm going to focus on those options as sources of inspiration for designers and for this task that you are really starting, or you are doing in this Congress, which is to think about the innovation and ways of not just protecting the past, but engaging into the building of a new world. Colombia is also designing, quote unquote, the future of the high mountains, the páramos. Páramos are the sources of water in the whole country. 70% of the population rely on good quality of water that comes from the high mountains. Bogotá has one of the best waters in the world, very little treatment because this water comes from the páramos. Hopefully you can visit a páramo nearby. It's just 1.5 hours, 2 hours by car. I'll enjoy a magnificent landscape. But this landscape is also being destroyed by agriculture, by mining, by many interventions from different societies and groups. And it's in the discussion about how are we going not just to protect, but to rebuild a culture of sustainability in the páramos. Because we need people doing things there, but we need a functional ecosystem to keep providing water to the cities. So you'll see lots of discussions in the press during those days if you want to know a bit more about that. We are working into the delimitation of the páramos of Colombia, 3% of our territory, to make sure that we will keep water for the future. But there's people, as in the picture you may see, that lives and produces food. So there's contradictions, and I'm glad that the SDGs issue was raised and brought here, because those contradictions needs to be solved through design, and not just through landscape design, which could be an option, but design of new ways of doing things. So this is the history of Colombian transformation, and design of our tropical landscapes, not just in the Amazon, but everywhere. And probably this region, the yellow region, yellow, and here orange region, is where most of the people of Colombia lives. And the Caribbean region is one of the most most near to collapse in terms of ecosystem and ecological functioning. The Caribbean region whipped out its dry forest a long time ago. Less than 10% of its original forest cover remains. And also the Caribbean destroyed a huge amount of wetlands to replace those wetlands by bananas or by cattle ranching or by other productive activities. And this destruction is really now felt. The levels of erosion and losses in productivity, and especially exposure to risk by floodings and also by fire, is increasing very, very rapidly. The reds are here, the places where nowadays is being developing this ecological destruction. You see plenty of places which are replacing wilderness by people. This is the red front of colonization of the Amazon, and you see here as well in the southern parts of the Orinoco region and in the mountains and the Pacific coast of Nariño. And you will get news from many places in Colombia which are being challenged by discussions or by people and movements of people trying to replace the last remains of, we say, wild ecosystems. But that wouldn't be a problem. We also need to use what is on the land to create new things. We need to produce food. We need to produce many, many things. And transformation of ecosystems is not a bad thing per se. The problem is when we transform and change those ecosystems far away from the turning point, from a threshold of resilience and sustainability. And this, we don't know where are we crossing those borders, those thresholds. And probably the effects are being felt as, and distributed as poverty, as social impacts of health problems, and we are not aware of those yet. The links between ecological destructions and overcoming the thresholds of sustainability are translated usually into not in well-being, but the contrary. This is a good picture about ecological change in Colombia. I invite you all to visit. It's in the central mountains of Colombia. It's a landmark. It's a landscape where these very, very impressive palms live. The palms, the palma de cera, the wax palm, is the national tree. And it's also an endemic species, and it's also threatened by extinction. This palm is protected by law, and we are very happy to open this landscape to tourism for people to look at a beautiful landscape. However, this landscape has a design failure. If you look closely, you won't see young palms. The palms are just dying standing on the landscape. And the paradox we have here is that if you try to create again the environment for the palms to recover, you will lose the quality of the landscape which is demanded by the tourism, because people won't be able to see the palm. This is the original landscape that was replaced. And according to the market demands, people doesn't want to see this. People prefers this. And the discussion about which kind of landscapes should we develop always falls in the middle of transformation and on how people is educated and how perceives the complexity of ecosystems. Too much wilderness, too much complexity is usually avoided because our minds are not trained to that complexity. Therefore, at the end, we try to replace some of that complexity or even all the complexity with very familiar landscapes such as this one. The pastures are imported, the cattle that is produced here is imported, and hopefully we still have some time to gain a bit of forest and to protect the palm for the future. But that's unsure. We have been unable to declare any protected area or initiative here because the local communities, the authorities, environmental authorities, and the academy and the owners of the land have not been able to reach an agreement to protect this beautiful and very important landscape. But still, there are many other landscapes that are being designed while we are talking here. And in any of those landscapes, you will find lots of biodiversity. So we still have opportunities. We have lots of room to create and define new types of environments for our own living, to build our new habitats and to integrate the ideas of sustainability in the land. Here you have some examples, landscapes in the Amazon, those that are being transformed and deforested. Here is Bogotá city with its mountains. in a different perspective. You have lots of green here. Here are a small mining, gold mining population in the Andean region. And here you have the frontier of agricultural industry in the eastern plains, which is also very, very rich on biodiversity. This is an image of those landscape changes that are occurring during the last decade, and which places are replacing forest by other types of land cover, but also places where the forest is being recovered. So both sides of the transformation are quite important and send us a sign that things can change and you can move from one side to the other. But of course, destruction is very far and easy, very hard. Destruction happens very fast and easy, and reconstruction and recovery happens in a very slow pace. So what we need to do is to combine conservation with innovation in the proper balance, to keep a certain way of balance. This is an image of those we call transitions, or transformations of certain type of landscape to another. And how sometimes you have, this is wilderness in Colombia. This amount of wilderness is what remains. Colombia has at least 50% of its land cover in that sort of ecosystem. Notice that I never talk about nature. I don't like the word, I don't use that. Perhaps we can discuss that after. But how wilderness is being transformed on sometimes very degraded lands by erosion and fire, also to cattle ranching or to other forms of rural occupation. Sometimes even very, very small amount of land goes to mining, energy, agricultural industry, and cities. Here, there's very little to cities, so you cannot see. But then you see cattle ranching also becoming again forest, and rural productions coming cattle ranching or both. So this is to emphasize the idea that change can happen and can be driven by political decisions, by design, by creating options. And I'm going to spend the last part of this lecture inviting you to understand the opportunities that we still have to really now design after what we have seen. Part of that is just looking at how we deal with change. What portion of change can be driven, can be controlled? What part of ecological and social change is spontaneous? You cannot do anything about that because it's happening, it's product of the complexity of evolution, and which part we can do something. And this is a product of Universidad de los Andes, Germán Andrade, and a team of people which is thinking about how to drive transitions and positive transitions and sustainable transitions for Colombia. You'll see the central concern of all transitions is risk management. When you change something, when you transform anything to another thing, you have to understand what are the stakes, what are you risking, what are you losing, what are you gaining. And I think this is the heavy discussion that is being avoided in the environmental planning in many places in the world, is how risky is to stay on our track, on our pathway, how risky is to change to many different types of options, and especially how risky is to confront uncertainty, because it's different to talk about risk and to uncertainty. But here are the positive things. We think that we can design at least 7, no, this is 7, this is a magic number. It's 10. You always say 7 Egyptian plagues, and there are 10, but okay. 10 socio-ecological transitions in Colombia. We identified 10 realms of reality that can be driven to a more sustainable situation with design, and that's the key. And I think that that's why I'm here. Those transitions, in a nutshell, cover the different types of relation of humans and ecosystems in a very specific set of land, in a very specific place. They are absolutely place-based changes or challenges to change. Of course, the most important thing is how are we going to manage the remaining wilderness of the country? Are we going to accept, like the news mentioned yesterday, the fishing of sharks in our oceans, while we all understand that species that are caught are threatened? I don't think so. We shouldn't be doing that. We know that this is not acceptable anymore. But how are we going to manage the remaining rainforest that we have? How are we going to manage the remaining wetlands of the country? And I apologize here to the people who work with the oceans, because my career has been always focused on land, on terrestrial ecosystems, and freshwater ecosystems. So, and Humboldt Institute, where we draw those data, works only in terrestrial ecosystems. So there's another 50% of Colombia that is made about seas and oceans. So we need to get how are we going to manage our wilderness when the option of protected areas is not anymore feasible. Why? Because it's very complicated, because it's expensive, because we already reach this capacity of protecting biodiversity with that measure. Then we have a very special challenge of recovering and designing ways of life in the wetlands. Colombia has 27% of the country dominated by wetlands, freshwater wetlands. So it's a country rich on freshwater, and probably is one of the richest tropical countries with this feature. So how to live in a country, plenty of rivers and floodplains, and the richest country, the second richest country on freshwater fish, by example. This is a resource that we are destroying every day with many ways of doing things. Also, another challenge is to handle the places and lands which were transformed into cattle, extensive cattle raising facilities. Colombia and the producers acknowledge that at least 20 million hectares of land used for cattle ranching shouldn't be on that activity and should be given to other use. Could be agriculture, could be forestry, could be even recovering wilderness. There's a challenge of working with many different types of societies, with, I mean, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity. Colombia has more than 100 groups of indigenous people, and each of them have a specific way of understanding ecology, understanding the relations with the rest of biodiversity. So working with indigenous is a priority. Working with black communities where they control, like own the territory, is equally a challenge. And finally, working with peasants, which are present all over the rural on the countryside. So we still have to create new types of governance for those places that are controlled by local and rural communities. We have the challenge to create new types of sustainable rural development based on the production of good quality of food, agricultural ecology or agroecology, places where we can produce even food for export. Colombia is traditionally a country with lots of agricultural diversity and good practices, and we can engage again into a challenge of producing new types of food. This ecosystem services-based rural development, which is written there, is the way of understanding that there's a very, very close relation between ecological functions and food production. And if we create the synergies for that, we will really be able to bring to the table a very different type of product. Challenges that you are familiar with: cities, eco-friendly habitats for humans and non-humans. How are we dealing with the remaining biodiversity after this great expansion of cities, but also how are we building new environments and habitats for sharing with other types of animals and plants. And this is a very interesting challenge in the world. The exercise of authority. This is a very important challenge we have, and it's everywhere. It's not just located in one place or another. It's who is in charge of the land. What are the rules that are building the governance of those places? This is a very particular type of transition, and it's based, of course, in creating more democracy, more participation, more capacities to really make everybody link again to biodiversity management. There's also the challenge of enhanced private investments in sustainable landscape design. By example, this is rice production. Colombia produces lots of rice, perhaps more than is needed. So you have always the paradox that there's overproduction of some things, and you are destroying wetlands and biodiversity and poisoning rivers because of the amounts of agrochemicals and toxic substances that are used to produce rice. But also you have the other option, which is have healthy and organic production of rice, which is already in place. Lastly, but not less important, innovations for best practices in mining, in energy production, such as dams, hydropower facilities, and all types of oil facilities as well. Always mining is unsustainable activity by definition, but the option is how are we getting mining into the construction and the build-up of sustainable and resilient territories. And there's the last, of course, option, which is to restore those places that have been poisoned by long time, but accumulated activities of gold mining, badly done, or by oil spills. We have plenty of oil spills, mostly because of terrorism and some by accidents. We have also poisoning by agriculture, toxic remnants, but that's plenty of reasons for soil degradation that we have to handle, and we are trying to account for the environmental passives that we have. So those transitions in a nutshell are the design challenge. And this design challenge, each of them has some qualities, some options that I won't get into in detail, but you are welcome to read and explore the book that presents and introduces the idea of transitions towards sustainability from Instituto Alexander von Humboldt. But you know, we really can do lots of things, but we need the help of everybody. Those challenges cannot be dealt by just one discipline, but just one sort of social actors. We need to work in teams to really create options and new ways of dealing with the destruction of nature. So for protected areas, we have plenty of options such as private protection, private conservation, but also the conservation by indigenous peoples of sacred sites. We have the options to protect places by the use of carbon taxes and new financial options. There's many, many ways of doing things, but we need also to open up our minds in how we manage those protected areas. In collective lands, probably what we need to do is to acknowledge the rights and strengthen the capacities of local people, to acknowledge the importance of local knowledge, and to create a strong link with those communities. This is happening in many places. There's the issue of co-management that in Colombia has a long history, in the Amazon with indigenous groups, and recently with Black communities in the Pacific coast, where there's districts of integral management, so places where the management is agreed between the local communities and authorities and the government. There's lots of things to think about: education in land management, in biodiversity management, and of course in the design of the products that are going to be the link between the local economies and the national economy and the global economy. So nowadays we are talking lots about green economy, we are talking about bioprospecting, we are talking about green design. How are we moving local resources and capacities into new products towards the global markets? And this is quite a challenge for property rights, for acknowledgement of the contributions of local knowledge into those products. Plenty of challenges for the amphibian landscapes. Since the people that colonized Colombia came mostly from very dry countries, Spain was a very, very dry country, and especially Castilla, it was one of the sources of that people. They were never used to the very and absolutely humid places in our lowlands, and they never understood the way the indigenous groups dealt with those ecosystems. And in Colombia, we had millions of people by this 15th century living from landscape modifications on the wetlands. They learned how to live doing massive production of fish, turtles, alligators, ducks, and many other animals that were the source of their food. So I already mentioned some options, but just let me emphasize, by example, the coffee economy of Colombia. The coffee economy is one of the most important sources of revenue, but also it's quite important in cultural terms. It's a very democratic way of producing things, and coffee in Colombia now is becoming much more and more specialized into link the product with the ecosystem. So we have lots of bird-friendly coffee, bat-friendly coffee, fair-produced coffee, and this is growing quite fast, and some of the revenues are becoming invested in conservation. But this is coming too slowly, and we need to speed up the making of a coffee economy based on sustainability and biodiversity conservation and management. So we need lots of design for that economy. I mentioned rice. There's the big discussion of oil palm. Should we allow more oil palm, less oil palm? This is a big issue for Europe because they have to decide where to buy their oil palm. How is going to certify that this oil palm is produced with very strict rules that make sure the buyer that this oil palm is not based on the destruction of the ecosystems or in the abuse of some communities. And now we are trying to certify all of the oil palm production from Colombia. And it's quite important to understand that the oil palm in Colombia is compromised to not to be built against the destruction of the rainforest or the desiccation of wetlands or the environmental destruction. But you need to tell the history to make sure that the buyers have warranties that this oil palm is absolutely free of abuse. of ecological abuse. And we have cocoa, we have native fruits, all sorts of agricultural production that should be engaging into the design of sustainable landscapes and fair trade and putting a bit of the revenues into conservation. And I think this is kind of the next stage of the green economy, to make sure that at 20, 10, 5% of the revenues of anything, of everything, comes and goes to production, of sustainable production and ecosystem conservation. So next time you go to the supermarket, please try to see if this product is really paying any type of ecological tax, and choose that one. And let the producers know that you are doing that, of course. This is cattle ranching. We have, probably here is where we have more options for redesigning the landscapes. There's a huge amount of research done to produce meat and milk under the forest and within the wild ecosystems. So if you're planning to get vegetarian, think twice. Maybe eating sustainable meat is possible, but make sure that it's certified. Green cities, of course not the case of Bogota. There's lots of green, but probably not well managed. Hopefully, next time you visit us, we'll get better forest quality and especially a place to go to walk. Because if you try to do that nowadays, you won't be allowed. This is a contradiction. We have plenty of good quality ecological spaces and open places for people, but it's forbidden. So this is an issue of governance, it's an issue of land management, just a couple of blocks from this university. Here, for the green cities, of course, I will get into that in a minute. What we need is more participation, more citizen engagement into the design and ways of living in the cities. How are we inviting our 80% of people that is living now in cities to really participate into the construction of new environments, new habitats? And it seems that everybody is willing to do that. Everybody wants more open space, more public space, more green space in the cities. So it's now part of all political campaigns, all NGOs, all citizen movements, which is great. This is an image of Medellin, where there's lots of places that are being declared protected areas in the middle of very expensive buildings against the pressure of the developers. And it's working well because people prefers, and people is expressing that preference in the political realm to protect even the smallest pieces of land. So it's possible, but it needs lots of people engagement. And this is a debate, a huge debate. Are we going to design more hydropower plants? Are we going to design other types of facilities, other types of mining? How much of them we need for the future? When are we stopping to do this infrastructure which has a huge environmental impact? We have to weigh the risks and the benefits that we are getting from those investments, from those inversions, from those activities, because we need really a clear sign that we are not allowing the destruction of ecosystems and the functioning of those ecosystems in the future, because we depend on the health of them to deal with climate change. So I won't go far here because it's quite a complicated issue. Let's see. But the good news is that this transition is happening. And it's happening independently from the government policies. It's happening because there's lots of investment from the private sector to build sustainable ways of doing things, sustainable entrepreneurship. But there's also lots of experiments from communities and the civil society, which is doing what they can and they should be doing, which is protecting biodiversity, protecting the land, and engaging into lots of new economic experiments, new institutional experiments, new ways of designing their societies. Of course, this is not happening without conflict. This is not happening without lots of tensions. And I think the next years we will see a huge discussion on the role of national governments in governing those transitions and creating a new type of democracy, a new type of governance, because the tension between the local and the national is growing very, very quickly. Some tools for transitioning, and I'll spend the last 5 minutes on them. Of course, knowledge management. Academy needs to be relevant and has to produce proof that these transitions are easy, that we really can move ahead and transform our ill activities, our unsustainable practice into something else. So we need academy working for sustainability. We need to provide information, but assembled information and knowledge to the public to engage them and invite them to discuss what are the futures, the potential futures, depending on their decisions. That means discussing scenarios, future scenarios with people, assembling people and tell, if we keep doing this, this is the most probable outcome, but there's other options, and how we can create new narratives for the future. We need to build capacities for participation and create new types of social agreements to really accept that we need to sit together in a table to design the future. This is not a matter of the government, this is not a matter of NGOs, this is not a matter of social local organizations. We all have to participate into the building and designing of the future. Of course, we need to put money on that, but not just money. We need to put time, we need to put other types of resources to do that, and everybody has some type of resources to participate into the design of this new world. Institutional innovation, that's the result of those agreements to work together to do things, and of course, massive environmental education, especially in Colombia, one of the countries with the highest biodiversity, where people still think that wildlife is made up of lions and elephants. So the question for many of us, one of the questions that we can guess, it's if we can make chocolate from oil, by example. What are the connections of extractive industries with sustainable territories or activities? Can we really get enough revenues from oil that make us think that it's worthwhile to keep working with oil during the last day? Everything. And we have plenty of examples of citizen science going on. We have tons of people and communities putting camera traps, having apps in their phones to report on birds and plants and behaviors. Oh, I'm sorry. There's plenty of activities everywhere that help us to participate into the design of the future. And this is the only way when we get ownership of our lands and ownership about the future. We need to engage people onto that process. We need to call upon creativity. The role of arts is absolutely fundamental for this task of inventing the future, because science will teach you always that truth has to be built under certain frame, and the only way to get out from those pathways and really create alternative futures is to use art, to make everybody think out of the box. This is a science fiction comic that we produced a couple of years ago about kids searching for options to keep resilience in Colombia. Of course, we have to deal with new technologies and see how them are going to help us to build this new future. Talking about ecology means that we need to understand better the relations among organic beings and inorganic beings. The cyborg advent is a reality, and we need to make sure that we insufflate the human into the cyborg. We need to use robotics to protect our forests and our species. We need to use our networks and computer capacity to create and disseminate knowledge. So we have lots of opportunities to really understand how can we design those new ecosystems without the split, and that's why I don't speak about nature, of humans and nature, which is a false split. We have never ceased to be natural. We are part of nature, and we are absolutely linked to every organic process in the planet, so there's no way of solving anything by keeping us out of nature. So when people think about let's get closer to nature and plant a tree, this is meaningless, could have some sense, in some linguistic sense, but we are nature. We have our guts full of microbes. We live in places full of animals and plants, and we cannot live out of nature. So we are getting into a new era of digital ecosystems, virtual ecosystems, and a new layer of meaning that is being built among cultures. And this is good. I think this is one of the most promising alternatives for the future, and we need to accept that this is an option for the times forthcoming. Atiquigua, which is an indigenous lady in Bogotá, provide us kind of a almost final sentence. Even male indigenous people are unable to face the challenge of the environmental crisis because males from other cultures choose our leaders to talk without thinking in women. Now women will take care of the earth, women will take the place of man, even in the most traditional societies. And of course, there's other kind of people that are asking ourselves, what is our nature? What's our role? How are we dealing with our bodies in these new ecosystems? And how are we dealing with our identities? And how can expand the experience of the world by our own experience? In summary, I would say that the message is a message plenty of hope. However declining, we still have lots of biodiversity, at least in Colombia and many tropical countries. And also, I think that we have more consciousness about what we have, what's the challenge ahead. Also, we have more knowledge, less disseminated than it should. That we have plenty of stakeholders willing to work together, on the private sector, the academy, some governments, civil society, and we have to use this capacity and willingness for designing the future. We have enough material to redesign the world, even among the critical scenarios of climate change. So welcome the design after. Thank you very much. Thank you.